The largest Civil War battle west of the Mississippi was fought here, in what is now the heart of Kansas City. When you go to the Country Club Plaza, Luce Park, or about a dozen other places, you are on or near a Civil War battlefield. In this video, we'll explore the Battle of Westport and the events that led up to it. I'll show you places around the city where key events occurred, and because this battle is part of a larger story, we'll travel all over Kansas and Missouri. We'll also explore how people in Kansas and Missouri remember this chapter of history a little differently, sometimes for good reasons, and sometimes despite the fact that people on both sides of the state line actually had quite a bit in common. At the end of the video, we'll get into the most interesting part of the story, its significance. The Battle of Westport is often referred to as the Gettysburg of the West, and it's the climax of Price's raid. That's the last major Confederate offensive in the Civil War. Historians often refer to the Battle of Westport as the Gettysburg of the West, and they make the argument that what happens here is absolutely pivotal to the larger story of the Civil War. But you'll notice that some general histories leave the battle out completely. So at the end of this video, I'll offer my take about why I think this battle is so significant and why it needs to be remembered. But before we get to the answer, we have to get into the questions and get into the things that make history so interesting, the story. Let's start with an overview that gets right at the heart of the significance of this battle. Gettysburg marked the end of Confederate offensives in the North. The Union victory here at Westport in the fall of 1864, that marked the end of major Confederate offensives in the West. After Westport, the Confederate Army Sterling Price had led into Missouri with high hopes of installing a pro-Confederate government. That army is disintegrating as they retreat south from Kansas City. 2 days later, that army is thoroughly defeated in one of the largest cavalry engagements of the entire war. That happens at the Battle of Mine Creek in Pleasanton, Kansas, about an hour south of Kansas City. After Westport, there is no more Civil War in the West. So while Gettysburg was significant, Lee's army continued to operate, but Westport is decisive. So why have so few heard of this battle? I think a big part of this is the fact that we tend to focus almost exclusively on Lee's Army of Virginia, but that's not how civil wars work, and no one knew that better than the people of eastern Kansas and western Missouri, and they had learned that lesson years before Fort Sumter. Now let's fast forward to the fall of 1864. The Confederacy is on the defensive, just as it had been at the start of the war. In 1862 and 1863, they led major offensives in Maryland and Pennsylvania in an attempt to swing Northern public opinion against the war. But in the fall of 1864, the Confederacy is in no place to try that again in the East. But the strategy remains appealing. Enter the self-proclaimed Confederate government of Missouri. That government was forced into exile shortly after the start of the war, and by this time, they are operating from Marshall, Texas. The Confederates in exile, they want the Confederate Army's help to take what they believe is their rightful place leading Missouri, just as they had at the start of the war before their coup attempt failed and they were replaced by a conservative Unionist government in a constitutional convention. So the Missouri Confederates convince Confederate leaders that they can take the offensive in Missouri. In fact, they do such a good job that from the perspective of Richmond, Missouri starts to seem like a place the Confederacy can actually take and hold ground. So they ordered Confederate General Sterling Price to move his army up from Arkansas and take control of the state. If Price succeeds in Missouri, that would give fuel to anti-war Northerners who were tapping into this nagging doubt that grew each month the war went on. Is this war winnable, and is it even worth the cost? If after 4 years of fighting, the North actually lost ground as Missouri left the Union and joined the Confederacy, that would be devastating to Lincoln and the Republican Party just before the presidential election in November of 1864. So in September of that year, Sterling Price leads an army of 12,000 men from Arkansas into Missouri. The goal is to take St. Louis, then turn west, capture Jefferson City, and install a pro-Confederate government. The first battle isn't encouraging for Price and his men, although it is technically a victory for them as they forced Union defenders to retreat from their small fort at Pilot Knob in southeast Missouri. Although outnumbered by 8-1, the Union soldiers managed to repulse repeated Confederate attempts on Fort Davidson before slipping away during the night on September 26, 1864. But before they retreat, Union forces detonate all the ammunition and all the supplies they couldn't carry. 3 days of maneuvering and fighting, and the Confederacy had lost far more men than the outnumbered Union defenders. They also failed to acquire the arms and ammunition they desperately needed. I'll come back to the Battle of Pilot Knob and the breakdown at the end, but for now, this causes the first important decision. Price changes plans and decides not to attack St. Louis. After all, if they struggled to take Pilot Knob, St. Louis seemed out of the question because it was far better defended. Confederate leaders knew this was a possibility when they authorized Price to leave Arkansas, so he had a plan B. Should St. Louis prove impossible to take, turn west and rally the loyal Southern Missouri men to join your army, and then capture the state capital of Jefferson City, where you could still install a Confederate government and worry about St. Louis later. But as he moves west, Price becomes convinced that he also lacks the force needed to take and hold Jefferson City. So Price's army keeps moving west, raiding the countryside for horses, food, guns, ammunition, and sometimes a lot more. The invasion had become a raid. Price needs a victory, and he sets his sights on Independence and Westport. As Price's Army of Missouri moves west, they fight small skirmishes, but there's little to give Missouri men who had not already enlisted in the Confederacy reasons for doing so now, as Federal armies move to intercept Price. And because Price is raiding the countryside for food and supplies, he's not exactly winning a lot of support, and he can only move as fast as his wagon train full of looted supplies. By the time Price got to Independence, his army faced Major General Samuel Curtis's army of the border to the west. Curtis held ground around Westport with a mix of Federal troops, volunteer cavalry, and Kansas militia. And to the east, cavalry under Major General Alfred Pleasonton approached rapidly. After a series of skirmishes, Price and his 500-wagon supply train needed to cross the Blue River here at Byram's Ford, and they needed to do so quickly. Price orders a diversionary attack against Union forces in the area, while the rest of his men move quickly across the river. It's a significant feat, but Price is still being pursued, and there is fierce fighting all around this area, which is today just northeast of Swope Park. You can visit Byram's Ford Historic District and the Big Blue Battlefield Park, which preserves about 80 acres of the battlefield and offers a nice walking path along the Blue River. That trail also has a few historical markers, and it's very near where some of the fiercest fighting took place. There are some other historical markers in the area, although they are a bit scattered and hard to find, so if you decide to visit, be sure to use the Battle of Westport driving tour in Clio, because it will show each marker in relation to your location, which is key because some of the markers are a bit remote. Pleasonton's cavalry arrived ahead of his main force, and they attacked the rear guard of Price's army as it moved towards Westport. The name of this location, Bloody Hill, is not an exaggeration. A few miles away, the John Warnell House became a field hospital with surgeons operating on wounded men from both sides. Today, the John Warnell House operates as a museum, and they have exhibits on the early history of Kansas City, including this battle. I'm working with the museum and some of my colleagues at UMKC on a local history project. I can't wait to share it in a forthcoming video, along with some other history projects around the city. For now, make plans to see the Warnell House if you haven't done so recently, and from there, you can go for a walk around Luce Park and explore the markers that are part of the next chapter of our story. After crossing the Blue River, the Luce Park area, that's where Price's army sets up his battle lines. There are several historical markers in the area designating Confederate positions at the start of the Battle of Westport. Meanwhile, Union forces under General Curtis, they're lined up north of Brush Creek. The next time you're at the plaza, really anywhere from the Fontaine Hotel to Jack Stack. If you were at any of those places on October 23, 1864, you would have been in the midst of Union lines. This historical marker correctly identifies the Union position, but it's actually south of the creek on a bit of green space. The people who added these markers all over the city, they had to get a lot of permissions, and they probably just didn't get the okay to put the marker right in the middle of the plaza. To date, the plaza has never really embraced its Civil War history. I love the statues and the historical figures on the plaza from Churchill to Ben Franklin, and how cool would it be if there was some Kansas City history mixed in as well? Sterling's Confederate troops make several assaults on the Union line early in the battle, but they're never able to break through. When you read primary sources, you'll get the sense that they are a bit surprised by the stout Union defenses because the militia don't usually hold ground against men like those led by Price, including Joe Shelby and his Iron Brigade. These Kansas volunteers, they repel each offensive. Now it doesn't hurt that they're equipped with Spencer repeating rifles, which can fire as many as 20 times per minute, while the Confederates have traditional rifled muskets. It's one of the most effective uses of militia in the war, so while they hold, Curtis can plan a way to capture the high ground with the help of some local intel. A few blocks south of the plaza, at the northern edge of Luce Park, this marker notes the main Confederate force, which stretched along a stone fence on what is now 51st Street, from current-day Oak Street all the way west to the state line. A smaller Confederate force formed a defensive line along present-day 55th Street. That's the southern border of today's Luce Park, and that's now home to a wonderful set of historical markers and a replica Civil War cannon, all created as part of an Eagle Scout project.
Sometimes history is hidden in plain sight, and that's absolutely the case with this marker that's easy to miss, but tells an incredible story. This is a quiet neighborhood right now in 2026, but if I could have been here on October 23, 1864, I'd be in the midst of a movement of Union cavalry and artillery going up this hill to take the high ground in a pivotal moment of the Battle of Westport.
In the midst of the battle, a local farmer wanted Union troops to send Confederates running, so he told them about a narrow passage up the hill here. Curtis sends the 11th Kansas Cavalry up the path, and sure enough, it leads them to high ground behind Confederate lines, a perfect place to fire down on the Confederates. So why did the farmer do this? Here we need to rely on a story that's probably impossible to verify, but just because something is a bit of a local legend doesn't mean it's false. Historians work from limited sources, and oftentimes, when a myth keeps getting shared, it's because it contains something essential. Like many Missourians, the story goes, the farmer was not pro-Union, but Price's men had just raided his property and stolen his horses. Even a beloved mare he begged them to spare because she was pregnant. A mare in this condition would surely not help the Confederates with their raid, the farmer pleaded, only to be insulted and then beaten, and then they still take the horse. Union troops follow the path the farmer showed, and from there, they fire down on Confederate lines. Price's army had no choice but to retreat back to its defensive line on the south end of Luce Park.
So I'm in my car right now, but I wanted to give you an idea of the topography of this war. So here's our historical marker for the Union position, showing how Union soldiers were led up a hill that allowed them to flank the Confederate position. This is the path, roughly, that they would have taken.
With little ammunition to spare and facing heavy fire, and with Union troops advancing from the north and the east, the Confederates retreated. Next time you walk this part of the park, imagine the old farmer searching to see if his horse had managed to break free from her retreating captives. Before this debacle, Price had hoped to attack Curtis at Brush Creek. After forcing Curtis to fall back, Price planned to turn back east and then take on Pleasanton's men. Instead, Curtis was advancing, and Pleasanton's main force was crossing the river and hammering the Confederate rearguard. Price knew he had no choice but to make a rapid general retreat from the Kansas City area. Thanks in part to seasoned Confederate leaders like Joe Shelby covering his retreat, along with the failure of a Union force to block their escape, Price's army manages to escape Kansas City. There's a handful of skirmishes in South Kansas City, all the way south to 119th Street, that also have historical markers. Now in this way, Westport is a little like Gettysburg, as the Union failed to really follow up their victory by attacking the retreating Confederates. But with the Battle of Westport, they do aggressively pursue Price, and just a couple days later, they catch up to him and decimate Sterling Price's Army of the Missouri in one of the largest cavalry engagements of the entire Civil War. That battle happens near Pleasanton, Kansas, about 50 miles south of Kansas City. It's named after Union General Alfred Pleasanton, whose cavalry, though outnumbered, captured nearly 1,000 Confederates and 2 Confederate generals. After the Battle of Westport, the Confederacy will never again represent a significant threat west of the Mississippi River. So how do things go so wrong for the Confederacy in Missouri? Price and his men had a set of objectives that reflected hope more than reality. The so-called Confederate governor of Missouri, he was operating out of Texas, and he needed an army just to re-enter the state he claimed to govern. This should have been more of a red flag for Confederate leaders, and just maybe, there weren't actually masses of Missouri men who hadn't yet joined the Confederacy to this point, but would rally to Price's lines. The only realistic way that happens, in my opinion, is if Price had a force capable of taking and holding ground. So the invasion turns into a raid, and that meant alienating the civilian population and moving at the speed of an ever-growing wagon train of looted supplies. Price is probably right to avoid a real fight at St. Louis or Jeff City, but that's not going to inspire confidence or move the needle for the Confederacy. So without major victories, there are simply more men and more resources for the Union who will eventually catch up to him. That ends up happening in today's Kansas City, and that's where the decisive Battle of the West is fought. And the result is significant. Price's army is not only defeated, it is run out of Missouri. The story, then, is not the Battle of Westport alone, but the failure of Price's raid. We can appreciate that the climax happens here in Kansas City, but we shouldn't conflate the final chapters with the full story. You may hear people claim that the Battle of Westport is a turning point of national significance. This claim relies on something that's difficult to prove or disprove: the theory that Lincoln would have lost the election of 1864 had the Confederacy won. But keep in mind, an improbable victory at Westport would only mean that Price's army was still intact. To change the results of the election, the Confederates needed to make Northern voters believe that the war was unwinnable. For those who want to make the claim that Westport and Price's raid is significant, I think there's actually a better argument. The Battle of Westport is the most decisive victory by American forces in a border state, and it's the final chapter of a story that proved the Confederacy could not take or hold ground in Missouri. Keep in mind that despite Lincoln's fears, he wins in a landslide, and I think there are bigger factors at play that teach the most important lesson of the war: the power of the vote in a democracy. The Democrats end up being badly divided in their message about the war, with their official platform calling for an immediate end, but their candidate, a former Union general, he repudiates that platform. The Democrats, then, are the House divided in the election, and with Union victories like Sherman capturing Atlanta, voters gave Lincoln 55% of the popular vote and 90% of the electoral vote. Lincoln wins Missouri by a landslide, about 70% to 30%. Thomas Fletcher, the Unionist governor of Missouri, he also wins legitimacy with a 70-30 vote. Both Missouri and Kansas voted for Lincoln by an overwhelming majority. While Missouri and Kansas have different Civil War histories, the people of these states often shared a common enemy: bushwhackers who raided farms and towns, and in 1864, those guerrillas fought alongside Price's army. Here's an example. Columbia, Missouri. A group of Columbia citizens had formed the militia unit called the Missouri Tigers, and these men defend the town from Confederate guerrilla bands. Perhaps this shows Jayhawks and Tigers have more in common than we think. In any war, the side with the greatest manpower, technology, and supply, they prevail as long as the leaders are at least mildly competent and as long as they are supported by the civilian population. If you're the weaker side in a war, the best way to turn the civilian population against those leaders is to have the war drag on. The opposite happens with the Battle of Westport, and that's why it's so significant. With the Union victory here, the West is secured for the Union, and Missouri, a pivotal border state, is no longer a place where Confederate armies operate. Perhaps just as important, the guerrillas join Price in his retreat. I always want to credit the librarians and the authors that make this work possible, so I'm going to leave a lot of links in the comments section to some of the best books and the best articles and the best library resources that have helped me. Thank you for watching this video, and if you'd like to see more, please know that subscribing to this channel and sharing these videos, that's what keeps me going. If there are videos on other topics you'd like to see related to the history of Kansas City, please let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching.